Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest edition of Humans at Work, HDO's webinar series. My name is Lewis Miller, and I'm the Assistant Director at HDO. Today, we are joined by Dr. Mary Rose, Professor of Sociology here at UT. She also teaches in HDO's Master's Degree program. Dr. Rose is here to discuss teamwork. We all know that working effectively in teams can be difficult, but it's increasingly necessary in a rapidly globalizing economy. Dr. Rose will focus on a few key questions. Under what circumstances do we perform better in the presence of others? And when do groups get in our way? Are some tasks better suited than others to teamwork? A few notes before we get started. Please mute your microphone and turn off your video during Dr. Rose's presentation. If you have any pressing issues or questions during the session, feel free to send any HDO staff member a private chat. At the conclusion of the presentation, there will be approximately 15 minutes for Q&A. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Rose. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Hi, hello everyone. I am Mary Rose and I am an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at UT. I am really excited to be here with you today because this question is, to me, so valuable and so fundamental in so many contexts. I, in fact, work in a very particularized context, which is I study juries and jury decision-making in the legal system. But as you can imagine, that is but one kind of team, and you probably didn't think of juries as a team that comes to mind when we talk about this. And yet it is a group of people working together trying to problem solve a task. And in that way, I find the question continually interesting of what benefits come from groups and what are some challenges. So I use this as an opportunity to kind of review the literature and think about some of the basics. The thing that struck me at first as I was looking up information and thinking what I wanted to present to you today is really the challenge of defining teams and the work that teams do, and tackling effectively the notion of what helps teams, what hurts teams, how to have very productive teams is going to be way beyond a 45-minute presentation, of course. But even just deciding when are you in a team gives you an appreciation of all the ways that people, of all the variables that are at work here and what's going on. So if we just think for a moment about the thing that comes to mind often is a work group. And this could be a team that the boss put together as part of your organization and decided who was going to be on it and under what circumstances they were going to be on it. And their job is to tackle a particular project or to problem solve or to brainstorm for the good of the workplace. But in addition, there's contexts like a board of trustees who might be doing even bigger picture planning and deciding and oversight. There's obviously teams in government who are working to solve crises that might come up. They're also doing strategic planning, and they are aiming to try to, problem solve and plan ahead. But at the same time, there's very different kinds of teams in other settings, which would include, people who are working on the same shift in a coal mine, right? They are a team. They are jointly working together, tackling a problem, and having to figure things out as they go along. And of course, there are literal teams when we think of as sporting events. So trying to capture all of these contexts makes you realize that the folks who do this for a living, who look at this in particular, say at management schools or at trying to train organizations, they are thinking about teams in very complex ways and asking questions like, what are the relationships between the members? What tools are people using in this context? What is the task? And I, of course, am going to, in trying to come up with something to talk to you about today, realize that I really, my aim is to try to maybe go back to the basics and teach more general principles and talk about some more general principles that social psychologists have learned over the time period of research into this area. And to kind of keep it general, and then if you all think of things that are more applied, more specific to your context and have particular questions, then we can entertain those at the end, and I do welcome questions. So for today, just to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, I want to introduce you to some basic concepts of the notion of social facilitation versus social inhibition. These are two different realities of what happens when people work with other people or in tandem with other people. I want to focus maybe on some of the downsides of group work and this issue of when others inhibit us or get in our way or make work difficult, and to talk a little bit more specifically about what those mechanisms are. And I also want to talk about other examples of things that occur in group behavior to just be aware of and be on guard of and thinking about what happens when teams are working together and planning, in particular, doing decision-making tasks. And then I'll try to wrap up with some factors that researchers, particularly in my field, which is social psychology, what they point to as mitigating some of the negative effects, the concerns we have about what happens when we work with other people. Here we go. The effect of others on performance implicates some of the very earliest work in social psychology. If you think about social psychology as a field that is devoted to studying the social influence of people on people, then you can see how just the most basic questions are what happens when we are in the presence of others, and how does that differ compared with when we are in the alone or working on a task without the presence of others. And when I say early, I'm talking like 19th century. An early researcher was someone by the name of Triplett, whose work was published in 1898. And he was very interested in cycling, and he noticed that people seemed to perform differently and work harder or work differently when they were in the presence of others compared with when they were just, cycling on their own, trying to train, etc. And so this got him very interested in what is just the raw effect of being in the presence of others, and what implications does that have? And so he designed a controlled experiment, because he knew, well, I can't look at, people who cycle alone versus those who cycle in groups, because they might be different. So he wanted to have, a context he could control. And what he did is he recruited a lot of children, basically folks between about 9 and 15, into a study. And their job was going to be, if you can imagine, almost like a fishing reel that you're turning as fast as you can. And it's not a fishing rod, it's attached to this long rope that goes in a circuit around kind of a box. And the goal, it has a flag attached to it, and the goal is to make that rope turn as fast as you can. And he had different conditions where he would have a child turn that reel as fast and as hard as they could, and he would, keep track of how quickly they were able to have the rope go around in a full circuit, and that's signaled by these flags on the rope. And in some of the conditions, he would have the child just stand there by his or herself and turn the fishing rod, or turn the reel. Then he had it designed so he could also have the person standing next to someone else doing the same task, right? So it's designed so that they can both be working either alone, or there's someone right next to them also madly turning this real. And what he found when he measured how fast the kiddos turned the reel when they were by themselves, he measured that and he compared with how they did when they were basically alongside someone or in competition with somebody, is perhaps unsurprisingly when they were in competition with others, they worked harder and worked faster. And the data, they weren't, he presented, and the trend in there was that it looked like they were going faster and working harder in the presence of others. And this developed, was labeled social facilitation. The idea that if you compared the same person working alone with that person working in the presence of others, you see improvement. And this has been replicated in several contexts, and especially when somebody is good at something. Most research suggests that if you have that person do something, that thing they're good at in the presence of others, they do better. So people who are expert pool players actually perform better when they have an audience, when they have someone watching them. And this is just one example of where the presence of others kind of hypes you up a little bit. It can make you a little more competitive and want to shine. So we can see some advantages of doing the exact same task in the presence of others rather than all by yourself. And in addition to that, you can think about several other benefits that flow from being in the presence of others and trying to accomplish a task. So things like you don't want to be embarrassed. You want to try to do your best work and not make a fool of yourself. And so you actually, that helps you work a little bit harder potentially. You learn things from other people. You watch what they do, and sometimes that can teach you new ideas, new insights. Other people can literally train you or mentor you in a group setting. There will be potentially ideas you never would have thought of, and you can build on those. And of course, people, you can be accountable to others and care what other people think. And for those reasons, and some I haven't even listed, there are reasons to think that being in the presence of others can bring out our better self, right? But then, if you are Charlie Brown fan and know that you have instances where you're the goat in a situation, and that the presence of others means that you choke and that you fail because you are so, for many reasons, but because you're nervous, because you really felt like your performance mattered too much, things were on the line, it was that free throw that was gonna affect the whole game. All of these things are examples of where the presence of others hurts your performance, and particularly if you're not good at something. And that gets the label social inhibition. And here the idea is that the presence of others gets in our way and hurts our performance. Researchers again and again a long time ago were very interested in this issue and the general question of how is our performance affected by others. And a scholar by the name of Ringelmann very early on developed a really interesting research paradigm involving rope pulling. And what he did is come up with a way to have an individual pull hard on a rope, and they were instructed to try their hardest and do their best to pull on this rope, and they measured how hard that person worked. And they did this for lots of individuals. They would come to the rope and they would pull, and then we would get a measure of how hard they were working and across the time period. Then what Ringelmann did is simply take those people for whom we had individual level measures of their effort. He took those people and he put them on a team to do rope pulling. So just exactly what you think of when you think of rope pulling. But in this case, they were pulling against a fixed structure that could measure how hard they were pulling. And logically, you would think that if you took, say, 3 people and you looked at how they performed when they pulled on this rope all by themselves, and you took each of their efforts, you gave them a rest period and they came back at it, but you have a sense of how strong they are, put them together, then the total work that and the total pressure and effort they exert during this task should simply be the sum of their 3 individual efforts, right? You have 3 times the effort going, so it really should just be the sum of each of their individual efforts. Well, the reason that I'm telling you about this study is that that is not how it worked out. Instead, it really didn't matter how large the group was. You always saw that what the group did in terms of its effort and the measure of how hard they were pulling was less than what you would have expected if you just summed together their individual contributions from when they had done it by themselves, right? So you know how they did when they were by themselves. You put them in the group and you simply ask, are the 3 of them or the 8 of them or the 14 of them adding up to each of their individual contributions? And the answer was no. They are not adding up to each of their individual contributions. It's less effort than you would expect if you added up those together. And so that allows us to say, uh-oh, there's something about the presence of others that is causing decreases in performance. Quite literally, they are doing a less good job as a team than they were as an individual. And there really are 2 theories out there for what's going on with this effect, which got called the Ringelmann effect. So the first one is what we call a coordination loss. That basically what happens when you work with a team as compared with working on your own is that you now have to coordinate with others. You've got to figure out how to distribute the work effectively. And what was happening in the rope pulling task is, for example, people couldn't take the same angle that they did when they were alone because there's someone right next to them and they couldn't quite get their best positioning. They weren't holding the rope in quite the same way because you had to make room for other hands to be there. And for example, if I am doing my hardest pull and I'm doing that at 5 seconds into the task, perhaps Joe, who's next to me, is doing his hardest pull 7 seconds into the task. So we are not coordinating our highest, most extreme effort at the same time. Instead of my effort is coming at one point, Joe's is coming at another, down the line. So what's happening and why you're seeing a loss is that people are having trouble coordinating with each other on this to achieve the end. And that is absolutely one explanation. However, there's some creative people who redid the Ringelmann study to try to rule that out, to see if this was really just about a problem of coordination. And the way they did it was to do the same thing, have a rope pulling task, you perform it when you're alone. And this time, though, you get put with a confederate, and I believe it was just a single confederate, so you weren't going to have the problems of positioning that you had with a group of, say, 8. And that confederate, or when I say confederate, what I mean is someone who's there to work with the researcher and knows what's going on, but is sort of acting acting and following a script that the researcher wants that person to follow. So the confederate here is pulling on the rope, but not actually really pulling very hard on the rope, but is trained to make it look like he's struggling and he's pulling, etc. And so this isn't a case of, oh, me pulling and the Confederates pulling and we're just not giving our best effort at the same time and we're not distributing. It really is the case that I just am not trying as hard in the presence of somebody else compared with when I was alone. And that we call a motivation loss. There is a way in which the presence of others allows us to say, oh, someone else has got this. It's not all on me. Therefore, I am allowed to slack off a little bit. So what this very simple study in rope pulling tells you about the downsides of the presence of others is that sometimes people get in our way, and that's what makes it hard to get things done. It's also the case that sometimes people enable us to slack off in ways that would not be true if we were on our own. Well, I'm imagining that most of you are not rope pulling today or doing something physical that involves these issues of, trying to get the best position for pulling a rope. So the question becomes, is this relevant for the kinds of things that we see in the workplace, which may involve non-physical tasks? And one in particular that fascinates me and that I think is really relevant is brainstorming. And this is such a common thing that you would entrust to a team for very good reason, for all the reasons I said about the positives of others, which is that you are, for example, going to be able to get a diversity of perspectives, and you're going to be able to hear ideas you never heard before, and that's going to help generate cool ideas from you. And so brainstorming seems like this perfect location where the presence of others should help. And, think about the typical instruction in a brainstorming task when you're doing it the way you're supposed to do, which is, come up with any idea that comes to mind, no matter how crazy it sounds or how unrealistic it sounds. In fact, in some ways, the wilder it is, the better. You must withhold criticism and judgment, let people speak and have their ideas come out, generate as many ideas, the more the better, so that, one of them might be viable, and obviously maybe build on the ideas that are expressed. Again, this all sounds such a perfect task for group work. Well, some social psychologists looked at this by having people brainstorm the answer to this question: what would happen if people had an additional thumb? And that was the task in this study. And I love that they used this task, because as I was preparing this and trying to learn a little bit more about this, I found that on Google you can find that this actually is a thing. Even though the study was done 50 years ago, there are people to this day who think about how it would look and what we could do to have an extra thumb. And it would be a thumb that faces inward like your regular thumb. And so basically what these authors did, and these researchers did, is have groups of varying sizes discuss this issue. And so their job was to, again, brainstorm, come up with as many outcomes of what happens if people have an additional thumb. They could think of positive things about the extra task that someone could do, how much more versatile the hand could be, and they had to give specific brainstormed ideas about what you could do with this extra thumb, but also maybe some negative consequences or things to think about, like what happens to the glove industry if there's we now have two thumbs instead of one. And their job was just to come up with as many outcomes and things that would happen if we had an additional thumb. And what these researchers did was to compare actual groups of people who were discussing the problem. So these were groups of 5, groups of 7, groups of 9. And he compared that with what we'll call a pseudo group. And that is the same number of people that formed by simply combining the responses of individuals who did this brainstorming task alone in a room. So they were given the exact same instructions as the group. Don't self-censor, don't criticize your ideas, come up with as many as you can, the wilder the better, and build on your own ideas, see what directions you go to. They were given the exact same instructions and told to brainstorm. And so what we now have are people who actually interacted with other people, and then people who did this individually, but we can combine their responses and count the number of ideas both the real groups and the pseudo groups developed, and take a look at what the results were. And the results were that no matter the group size, 5, 7, 9, when you combine the responses of individuals who were working alone, that generated more responses than did people who actually interacted in real groups. So basically, you had more ideas, more unique ideas, when you were letting people brainstorm on their own, as compared with this team. And it seems so counterintuitive. Why would it be the case that that people do better brainstorming on their own? And by the way, I should say, they also did a later study in which they looked at whether the quality of ideas were better in groups compared with these combined individual pseudo groups, and there weren't differences in the quality of the ideas. In fact, sometimes the individuals came up with better and more specific, concrete things. So what's going on? Well, I would say we're back to the same two issues. We've got a coordination problem, and we've got a motivation issue. So what do I mean here by coordination? What am I talking about? Well, I want you to think about what happens to brainstorming and to idea generation when you are doing that in the presence of others. And again, this is even if you're doing everything you're supposed to do to follow the rules of brainstorming. You are not criticizing, and you're not limiting yourself, and you're trying to build on ideas, and you're trying to follow the rules. Well, the reality is, in small groups, that we have norms about turn taking, and those norms are important and necessary. And unfortunately, the need to wait your turn interrupts your own creativity. That you have an idea, it's burgeoning, but you need to wait to start throwing it out to the group until another person has finished talking. Or alternatively, you're not good at the norms, and you're interrupting somebody who is trying to share his or her idea with the group, and you're interrupting their process. So that creativity and idea generation is being hampered and blocked by the presence of others. It's also the case that if you're sitting there waiting to take your turn, and you're sitting there trying to come up with ideas, the fact that other people are talking is distracting and introduces ideas and thoughts. So this is related to the first point, but it isn't even necessary that you're waiting to take your turn. It's just the fact that it's distracting to have to listen to other people's ideas. And the fact sometimes what people do in this waiting process is they're sitting there rehearsing their answers. This is what I'm going to say. This is what I'm going to say. And it actually undercuts their attention to other people. They're not doing the thing that we want from groups, which is to listen and build and help each other and come up with more than we could do with the individual. And so this is such a common phenomenon with respect to brainstorming that it gets its own special name, production blocking. So that is what I would argue is simply a coordination problem, that it is hard to say what you need to say and get your ideas out when you're trying to follow the norms of interaction with others, and it gets in the way of your ability, much like having too many people on the rope gets in the way of your being able to pull as hard as you want to. But there is also a motivational loss here. There is something about motivation. And this has been termed social loafing. It's a word my mother would have said, you're loafing around this afternoon, but meaning the argument is that what the presence of others does is allows you to back off. And again, just like the rope pulling thing, where the Confederate, it looks like he or she is working really hard, and the real person pulling is sort of telling him or herself that, you know what, I don't have to pull as hard if this person is here, and look how hard they're working, I can back off a little bit. That we call social loafing. And you see this in lots of contexts. If you're someone who knows a little bit about bystander intervention, it's something we worry about, that if you're driving along and you see someone who needs help on the side of the road, you're going to tell yourself a story about how your contribution, your call to 911, or your need to stop isn't as useful because obviously someone else has done it and you don't have to. And there's actually the presence of a lot of people around you sometimes undercuts your own sense of personal responsibility. And that you definitely see in the small group context, particularly as groups grow to be quite large, is what happens is that it permits people to basically hide and to not speak in a group and to avoid the accountability of having to speak. And it is possible for them to have sat through a whole meeting. And if the group is large enough, no one really noticed that Joanne in the corner never said anything, or Tim didn't contribute today. And that's particularly true if everyone is focused on their own contributions and what they need to say, and they're not really paying attention. And it is the case that some people just sort of, what you might call free ride, or go along with this, and that it allows them to not offer their ideas. This would be particularly true if it's not just like a cynical thing. Some people are shyer or more introverted, and it's harder for them to speak in a group. And as groups get larger, obviously the pressure on somebody to be the one who speaks up is lessened for any one person. It's also the case that it's sometimes unclear that your own contribution is going to be recognized. And by that, I mean that you are going to get credited for that contribution. Or alternatively, that it matters that you speak up. And I don't just mean that people notice, but that that it matters for your success and your sense of well-being, and that your pride. If you make a contribution, but nobody's gonna know that it was you, it's just the group gets credited with coming up with this great idea, that can contribute to this motivation loss as well, because you don't have the motivation or the competition or that sense of individual pride that is pushing you to contribute. And so you loaf, you back off a little bit and aren't as motivated to share. And in addition, it's the case that it may not be only about what is objectively happening in the group, but also a lack of trust that your idea will get credited. So this would be, you've learned in the past that when you give an idea and it's a really good one, you're not really acknowledged in the group, but instead 3 turns later, somebody else says basically the same idea, and they're the ones that get the credit because that person and the leader have some bond, or they, share something, or that's the person that everyone listens to. And so here the question is not just, is everybody getting it? Maybe individuals do get credit in this context. Their contributions are valued and noted, but the wrong people are getting credited, and you don't feel a sense of trust that your ideas or your participation is going to matter for you in the long run. So those are all things that can go along with the presence of others and with this sort of group-based work. And in fact, this is such a common thing that this idea of the justice of contributions and what happens when people offer something to a team, that is such a common issue that when I teach about justice in my undergraduate social psychology classes, when I am talking to people about justice principles and trying to get them to understand, what does it mean to distribute a resource equally? What does it mean to distribute a resource based on equity and what you put into it? And whenever I want to teach those as principles, for people to really understand the difference between those systems, I ask people to tell me about their experience with group projects in school. And I ask my students to share their experiences with a professor or a teacher in high school or a teacher in elementary school who assigns a group project. And I will tell you that the discussions that I have about this are so lively, and the students have so much to say because it's been such a part of their experience, up close and personal, to feel like you know what, we did this group project, so-and-so did nothing, but so-and-so ends up with the same grade as me, and I did so much more work, right? And so that's such a common thing, that the grade is determined by whatever the quality of the final project is, and the teacher or the professor is ignoring the fact that there was differential amounts of work put in by team members, but someone benefits. And people know of students who take advantage of this and free ride and social loaf because they can, because the system doesn't give individual credit for contributions. And that instead, some professors or teachers who know better know that if you're going to have a group project, it's probably a good idea to have a mechanism that recognizes individual contributions and the amount of work and who did what. And these, I will candidly admit, are incredibly challenging to do well. You're often relying on the participants on the group project to tell you, well, you know, you might have a system in which everybody rates everybody else on how much work they think the other person did. Of course, there's going to be error in that, because you only know at the end of the day, you really only know how much you worked, not what somebody else, how many hours they put into it. But it will pick up the instances where somebody didn't do their part in time and someone else had to rewrite it, and those kinds of things that happen in teams and in work groups. And to have a component of one's own individual grade reflect this equity principle. And it's also the case that we can have a conversation about what makes a fair procedure in group projects, what allows people to feel trust in the teacher or the professor, that they are going to listen and understand and take seriously what people say. So there's no point in rating other contributors on their on what they did for the project if the leadership is not really going to pay attention to that and is really just going to reward people he or she likes. So all of these things come up, and I just want to, I point this out to say how early people learn about the pros and cons of teamwork, because group projects are such a common feature of our educational system. For good, just like I said, for good, there's some things that come, and just learning to work in a team and negotiating all this is very important. But it also leads to a real suspicion of this, and it makes people wary about what's going to happen when they're in a workplace setting and they're not sure how credit is distributed. So as I've said, those are instances and things that social psychologists pay attention to about the reality of group work, which is there are coordination problems and there are motivational losses. And what you want to do is be aware of those and try to take steps to mitigate them. Well, what things are things we look at to try to understand where something like social loafing is going to come for? Obviously, you should be attentive to coordination problems as well, but this motivational issue where people feel free to slack off and not do their part, what is related to that, and how can that change? Well, obviously, a real question that comes up anytime we talk about an issue like this is it a function of group size? And I so wish that I could tell you, here's the right number of people to have in a group, done. Right? And the answer is 5, or the answer is 6, or the answer is this. And as I suggested before at the beginning of this talk, teamwork and the role of teams and organizations is so very complex and is so specific that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all rule for group size. And in fact, the kind of scary part about social loafing is that you find it even with the presence of just one other person. You find some motivational loss with the presence of just a few others. So, unless we're just going to abandon teams altogether, it isn't the case that there's some magic number where social loafing concerns go away. Certainly, you don't want a group to be so big that it's easy to loaf, and organizations should really look at what are the systems in place, and how are people really going to feel needed and valued here. But the size of what the right size group is depends a lot on what your goals are. So as I said, I'm a jury scholar, and I think a lot about the advantages and disadvantages of jury decision making. But one of the things I do know is that when you have a group that's like size 12, which is a typical size for a criminal jury, you're going to do a better job representing different ideas and different perspectives than you will with a smaller group. And what you want is the right size for what your needs are. And so maybe a group of 12 isn't important in an organization and would increase social loafing, but there might be an instance in which you do need such a wide variety of perspectives that you give up a little bit of the problems with the larger size group in order to have that diversity of perspectives and that cross section. So as you can imagine, there's no one size fits all for group size. The second issue is norms, and what are the messages that group members get about loafing. And some of these come from leadership, where the leader is attentive to this issue. The leader is letting people know that there are consequences for slacking off, or is just attentive to the fact that there are people staying quiet and has mechanisms, appropriate mechanisms, for bringing people into groups and to contributing and not letting them basically just watch while everyone else talks. But I want to say this circles back on justice, and particularly procedural justice and trust in an organization. So we have what an organization says. Don't slack, don't loaf, everybody needs to contribute, or everyone's contributions are valued, we need to hear from everybody. All those things might be what you say, but what people also learn is what they watch. And is somebody able to get away with slacking off and with not doing their job? And if that's the case, you're going to learn from that just as much as you would from what somebody says. So norms are important, and setting norms, but that means living up to them as well becomes very important. Finally, there is research that suggests a lot of this has to do with group cohesiveness. And when group cohesiveness is low, when people don't know each other, they don't feel part of a team, they don't feel team-like, you have a lot more opportunities for loafing, because people don't feel accountability for other people. They don't feel that it matters if they speak, or that, again, it's also related to trust. They're not trusting that their contributions will matter in the end. And so cohesiveness is another function that people want to take a look at and pay attention to. That, however, because I'm on that topic, I want to give a caveat about cohesiveness, and simply to say that social psychologists have recognized for a long time that there's sort of good cohesiveness and bad cohesiveness. And what you want is basically the right kind of cohesiveness. And by that, I mean that people feel that there is a team that has an identity and that cares about them and cares about their contributions, that people feel not only that they're an employee of an organization, but actually that they are a member of the team and that the team matters to them. Those are all important, feeling valued by your group. Those kinds of cohesiveness are good. But it cannot be mistaken for agreeableness and people just always being happy and cohesive because it's such a fun group. I will tell you that I love to work on cohesive groups that are agreeable. That is awesome for me. I don't like conflict. It makes me uncomfortable. I love it when everyone just seems to see the world the same way. But time and time again, we learn that the value of dissent is important, and it is a key component of a well-functioning team, a well-functioning group, where people feel free, within reason, to give the other side, to give their own opinion, to disagree in a respectful way. And that once you begin to move away or send messages that dissent is not okay, then you're getting the wrong kind of cohesiveness. And unfortunately, cohesiveness and dissent are in tension with each other. It is not possible to always have a cohesive group that feels great about each other, that wants to go out together, that feels like they're besties here in the workplace, and also have it be easy to have dissent. People's feelings get hurt, leadership gets threatened. Sometimes there is a point at which you have to cut off dissent in order to be cohesive and move forward. But when groups go over into too much cohesiveness, what you find is that people worry too much about being liked and worry too much about what their contribution is how it's going to be judged by them as a person. And that ends up being very detrimental to group work. And it can slide over into something you may have heard about in the popular press, which is groupthink, which is an extreme form of closed-minded thinking. And it's where basically either leadership or the group itself is distorting facts to achieve an outcome that they believe the leadership wants, and that facts are bent and stereotypes, and there's a lot more focus on an enemy rather than what the group is and the pros and cons of the group. People are not seeing risk realistically. Groupthink has been associated with some very major fiascos in decision making in the past, all the way with like the invasion of the Bay of Pigs back in the early 60s to the run-up to the Iraq War. In the Senate Intelligence Committee report on that, they said that groups were afflicted with groupthink. They had a goal, they wanted it, and it was basically things were going to be shaped and evidence was going to be contorted to fit that conclusion. And that really is a failure of leadership and somebody who has not figured out how to keep a group feeling good and that esprit de corps that you get, but also valuing dissent. Okay, I want to conclude here because I'm mindful of our time. And what I'm going to conclude with are simply not answers, but questions that I feel like are useful for people to be asking in this domain. And basically, I think a most basic one is, as the brainstorming research suggests, are teams always the right approach for a task? Is it the case that you're going to get the best information and the best results by using a team? Are there other ways you could do something in a brainstorming task or a creativity task that isn't so dependent on people having to wait their turn to talk and follow norms and not get interrupted? Are there ways you could design that? And so that requires thinking critically yourself about, well, what does this task require? Is this a task that needs multiple people to be interdependent with one another and get this done? Or is this a setting in which we need the group members to basically be nominal groups, to go off on their own and do something, and then combine and come together and see what you come up with? So that I worry when organizations think that if teams are good in one context, they're good for all contexts, because they're really not. And I worry a little bit about just even movement towards these really open concept offices where people are a team because everyone's always around them all the time and there isn't that kind of alone time. So we think a basic question for a team to ask is we the right tool for this job? And what systems of accountability are in place for the team? How will people know, and importantly, how will they trust that their contributions matter? And that means not only for the task, that if they say something, it's going to get listened to, that their ideas are valued, but also for their success in an organization. Are people going to be aware of and know that that they contributed, and they contributed something, helpful and special? Are there mechanisms for that? And also, are there systems for making sure people are contributing and not loafing? And then how is leadership supporting a team, particularly in managing dissent and encouraging that healthy kind of cohesiveness that helps people feel good about working together and not feel resentful or that things are unfair? So that's where I'm winding up, and I look forward to some time for questions. So I see a question that says, how do you think hierarchy within group impacts or affects the teamwork and decision making? So hierarchy is a reality. You're not going to, I've done research on how much small groups talk. And basically, anytime there's a more than one person in a group, talk is going to be distributed unevenly, and that some people are going to talk more than others. And also, it's the case that typically teams are not like these co-ops or things where everyone has to talk and there's no leader. Those happen, but they're not common. So of course there's going to be some amount of hierarchy. I would go back to the notion of, is there hierarchy in a context in which there's good accountability, when people can trust one another and trust that their contributions matter and will get listened to. I see another question on strategies to avoid groupthink. That is such a great question because it matters a lot. So here's what one thing that happens with people who dissent in a group is that some groups make them feel bad, not just because maybe their idea is wrong or they don't have their facts straight, but they're a bad person. They're a bad team member for dissenting. And so what you want to do to avoid that, because the dissent is important, it's really important that people speak their mind, because guess what? Particularly if there's a risky decision or there's concerns about the plan, it's likely that more than one person has reservations, but they're looking around and seeing no one speaking up, so they start to doubt their own reservations. And then if they see someone speak up and that person gets smacked down and basically gets treated like a bad member of the group, then no one's going to speak up. You have a recipe for agreeing with the leader and saying, yes, sir, you're the best. This is awesome. Yes, let's go with this. And so what you want to do is, of course, have a leader who doesn't need to have his or her ego be the center of the attention. But even if you have somebody, to have that leader be aware that what you should do is have space for dissent. And that really is something we used to call a devil's advocate. There's a lot of terms for it, but it's basically you assign somebody in the group the role of bringing up dissenting opinions. And it could be more than one person, but the idea is that person is permitted to speak wearing their hat of, look, I'm the assigned contrarian today. I'm the one who has to bring up the uncomfortable information. Other people could pass that person their thoughts and reservations, and that person speaks up for the dissenting opinion. And that is just an important part of all kinds of critical thinking, is to get reservations on the table. Again, you don't want this to go forever and to get bogged down, but you do need people to feel comfortable speaking and giving dissent. So I would say trusting expertise is one, and appointing people to be devil's advocates, and obviously stating norms in which, and stating and living up to norms where you value dissent. Another question is, does creating a team of people with shared individual goals increase individual productivity? Well, I would say if the system allows them to have those goals acknowledged and met. So I circle back to the idea that are we under a system in which their individual contributions matter here? But obviously, if people share goals, that's great, and you're not working at cross purposes. So my prediction generally would be it is better to have people with shared individual goals in a team and not working at cross purposes. It's just that I would argue there also needs to be leadership and a system in place to make sure that people can thrive and meet those goals. Symptoms of groupthink include basically no dissent being expressed. When dissent is expressed, someone gets labeled a problem. Another symptom would be stereotyping of an adversary, or because groupthink often happens to groups that feel that they're under threat. And so if what you're hearing when people talk about outgroup members or people not on the team is there's something wrong and we're all right and we have the moral high ground and they're terrible and there's no way they're going to be able to overcome our awesomeness. If you're seeing those kinds of stereotyping of yourself and of others and this sort of illusion of a moral high ground, you've got some concerns about groupthink and some symptoms of groupthink here. And there's sort of, I would turn you to work by Irving Janis if you're interested in sort of a whole analysis of what groupthink tends to look like and where he found it. It's not perfect. There have been some scholarly debate on it, but it's an accessible book called Groupthink. It says it is often the dissenting opinion that spurs the most thoughtfulness and conversation. Absolutely, and I agree that the Supreme Court in the United States is a great example in which what you'll see sometimes is that the dissenting opinion was the wise one, and that the expression of dissent and the formal expression of dissent in that context means it's possible that later that becomes the law, and shifts and convinces the majority to adopt that. And so I think that's just a terrific example of where the publication of a dissenting view is important, not just for that individual case, because you lost if you're in the dissent, but for the long term. So, you know, if you think about some odious rulings in our history, like Plessy versus Ferguson, which held up that segregation was fine, there was one dissenting judge who said that this is a violation of equal protection, this is wrong. And it just took a very long time, but eventually that did become the law of the land. So, and there was a time when dissents weren't published. So it's been a good development, I would say. How do you balance the use of teams and coming up with ideas with the concept that individuals are more apt to implement new strategies if they feel they are part of the creation of those strategies? That is such a great question, because I hope I've given you a sense that teamwork is really about balancing a lot of competing interests, and you've pointed to one that is a real challenge, which if I'm saying that things work, that brainstorming in particular and creativity works best when you give people some space to do that on their own. How do you then get buy-in from the whole group, right? You know, so you want to credit the brainstormer, you want to give them a sense that that was a good job and it was so cool that they came up with this, and you want the ideas to be on the table, but you don't want that to cloud over everybody else who's needed to actually put those policies in place. So a couple thoughts are, I do circle back to trust, and that the notion is that this individual isn't always and only going to be the only one whose ideas are listened to, so that leadership has found ways to have people, tack onto that, to continue the brainstorming together. Now that we have an idea we want to work with, how can we make it better? And that you want to look for opportunities to give group members buy-in and participation, and have them trust that contribution matters. So I have this question about, there's a question kind of about whether there's a list of tasks that are better or worse for groups. I picked on brainstorming just because the literature is pretty clear that creativity is hard to do in the presence of others, at least to the best kind of creativity. It's hard to give a kind of an inventory, because obviously if I'm talking about coal miners, that's a different question than if I'm talking about some sort of project at work. But what I would want someone to look at in thinking about the appropriateness of a group is to be critical, to ask yourself, why does this need a group? Is it because, as in coal mining, you actually need somebody there to make sure you're being safe because the work is too much for one person to do? Are there tools that require multiple people to use them? Are there complexities about the situation that are really important and need teamwork? But to just not assume that the group is always the best way to do this, and to ask questions about, what is it that I'm trying to get at with this, and what does the task involve that needs group membership? So I have another question that is, what about a team situation that does not involve creativity, like when there's a distribution of tasks towards a common goal? Is there more social facilitation in those cases? Again, I think accountability is really relevant here. You can distribute tasks all day long, but are people held accountable for their contributions? And I think that circles back to, you mentioned this common goal, and then there was a previous question about shared individual goals. I think that certainly does help, and it does help people to try to reach that. You can set up situations, in some ways you could rename some aspects of social facilitation as simply competition. And so are there avenues for healthy competition that in trying to reach that common goal, or a shared individual goal, is that I do predict that there can be social facilitation. But it is, I do think this notion of accountability matters a lot. If people feel they can slack off, I am sad to report that humans sometimes do. And that we want to make it a place in which people care what other people think, because that is the reason we use groups, so that we have that sense of face saving. Are some cultures more suited or favorable to teamwork, like Scandinavian or Japanese versus individualistic cultures? I think teams work in all cultures. I absolutely do. What I think is that how a team behaves and what it does is going to differ a lot across cultures, how you express that. So there have been, if you go to Japan or China and you see how their employees form a team and what they do to create shared identity and that sense of good feeling about trust in the team, if you try to import that back to the United States, you still may want a team, a shift of workers in a factory, et cetera. But you, at the same time, need to recognize that they might not be expressing their team loyalty in the same way. The documentary that just won the Academy Award this year was about this someone from China starting, and running a factory in the United States, and what some of the cultural clashes were. And you really saw that, where people would go to China and see how things get done in a team there, and then what you saw is them trying to bring that back to the United States to do songs and have a team mascot, or ideas and things to say chants at the beginning of a shift, and it just didn't work at all. So I think teams matter in both places, but how they're going to express themselves is different.
Hi, everyone.
Go ahead, Louis.
So that's all the time we have for this today. Thank you so much for joining us and for the great conversation. These were some really good questions. I will be sending a follow-up email to everyone that includes a recording of today's webinar. And if you have any comments or suggestions for improvement, please respond to that follow-up email. Your feedback is always appreciated. And once again, just thanks for joining us and for having a great conversation.
I really want to thank you. This was so much fun. Thank you so much. Have a great day.